So Stephen Bartholomeusz, Brian Hartzer, is set to take over at Westpac next year. What do we know about him?
We know quite a lot about Brian because he was a consultant to the ANZ some time ago, who was liked so much they actually hired him. When John McFarlane retired in 2008, he was John McFarlane's preferred candidate as his successor. The ANZ chose Mike Smith, of course. Brian followed John McFarlane to RBS, where John was a director, and ran their retail businesses very successfully for 3 years until he was recruited by Westpac to come back, where Gail Kelly gave him basically most of the bank, the Australian financial services businesses, where he's done a really, really good job. He's highly personable, American by birth, big personality, gregarious. People love him, his staff love him. When he came back to Australia, he was inundated with emails and letters from his former colleagues at ANZ, along with a host of job applications. So he engenders loyalty and warmth. So he's a very personable character, very different to Gail, who's a much more sort of controlled, measured sort of person.
What do you think those differences mean for Westpac's outlook?
I don't think they change anything dramatically. I mean, Brian has been running that business, the core of the business for the last 3 years, and he's basically been pursuing Gail's strategy, which is to say better culture, because internal culture drives performance and drives customer satisfaction, and they've now finally achieved the best customer satisfaction ratings in business and consumer banking. The strategy has always been about trying to improve cross-selling, and the more recent results of Westpac show that's been achieved while Brian's been running that business. So I think in terms of the core strategies, nothing much changes, but of course there's a lot of things happening outside the bank which will impact the way the bank's managed.
That's right. I mean, he's taking over a bank with a very healthy situation, but there are a few hurdles to face in the kind of near term. Yeah,
Gail leaves him a bank in terrific shape. It's got the most conservative balance sheet, the highest capital ratios, the best productivity ratios, cost to income, and so on. So it's very profitable. His 3 years of running the consumer businesses, double-digit compound growth in earnings. So the bank itself is in really good shape. However, the Murray report into the financial system gets handed to hockey later this month, and one assumes sometime in the new year the government will accept or reject the core recommendations. However, I don't think anyone expects the government to reject the recommendations we expect that will impact Westpac and the other major banks, which will see more capital required to be held, and may well change the way housing loans are risk weighted in a way that's adverse for the major banks, but most particularly adverse for Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, who've got the biggest proportionate exposure to housing loans. So if they have to hold more capital against housing loans, that's going to be a challenge.
Are there any other issues he's got to deal with beyond the Murray situation?
Oh, absolutely. I think all of the big banks, and small ones for that matter, are really focused on the prospect that the technology players, the Googles, the Amazons of the world, are going to move into their space. Payment systems to start with, you can now make a payment with an Apple phone, or I suppose a Samsung as well. That's the start of what could be incursions by these very large, very smart, highly cashed up technology players into what were traditional banking markets. And so that's a challenge that the banks haven't confronted before. It's not an easy one because we've seen what happens when technology meets incumbency. It's generally not good for the incumbents. But Hartzer, he's in his mid-40s. He did have a background in sort of banking consulting and technology. So he's well equipped, you would have thought, to work his way through that. And Westpac's got quite a good technology platform to start with.
Right, so in conclusion, if you're a Westpac shareholder or customer, there's really no reason to be pessimistic about the outlook here. He seems like a very logical hire.
He was the most rational successor, the most obvious successor, and the most predicted successor. For the moment he was appointed, he was seen as Gail's heir apparent. And I suppose Gail's period is going to be hard to replicate. She started at the cusp of the global financial crisis. She bought St George Bank, which beefed them up dramatically. She's seen the market capitalisation of Westpac more than double, from under $50 billion to more than $100 billion. That's not a bad record. So it's not going to be easy, particularly as there are new types of challenges that he's going to have to confront. So it will be an interesting period to see whether there is change in the way Westpac does things. they sing from the same song sheet today. Whether that's the case, and, when we look back with hindsight, who knows?
Be an interesting one to watch. Stephen Bartholomeusz, thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric.